Yes, I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me to join the creative disorder of this transdisciplinary discussion. There was much talk yesterday of the virtues of local embeddedness, but very little mention of the conditions for embeddedness. I think this discussion can be connected to what was asked earlier about knowledge of the body and so on. There was talk of the virtues of indigeneity, even of indigenous land. And these categories, I would argue, are defined by not being dominated by money. So I want to talk about the role of money and technology in generating the social or socio-ecological processes of the Anthropocene. Let's begin by reflecting on the notion of capitalism. It's generally applied to a particular economic system inaugurated in Europe no earlier than the 16th century. But some theorists have dismissed such a historical discontinuity and instead attempted to trace processes of global capital accumulation several millennia back in time. In this latter view, the real modern discontinuity was the shift to fossil fuels in late 18th century Britain. From this perspective, we can understand the deliberations of classical political economists such as David Ricardo and Karl Marx as reflections not on a completely new mode of production, but on the new kind of society generated by steam power. Capital accumulation had been pervasive in stratified societies for millennia preceding the Industrial Revolution. But steam-driven technologies were the particular form of capital analyzed by Marx. Pre-industrial forms of capital included farmland, livestock, roads, canals, armies, ships, and architecture. They too were material infrastructures that could be accumulated through the appropriation of labor power and natural resources, and whose expansion in turn contributed to further such appropriation. This is the cross-cultural essence of capitalist power, a recursive relation between some kind of material infrastructure on the one hand and the capacity to make claims on other people's labor and resources on the other. This definition of capital as based on appropriation prompts us to rethink our concept of technology. Technology here refers not to the blueprints or engineering knowledge required to construct a particular machine or infrastructure, but to that machine or infrastructure as a material entity, which requires continuous inputs of fuel and maintenance work to function over time. The continued operation of a given technology in this sense is contingent on asymmetric flows of energy, labor, time, and other resources, as Christophe has been talking about. Modern technology, in other words, is inextricably dependent on the rates of resource flows organized by the economy. This argument requires perspectives from both social and natural sciences. It thus may not make much sense to people trained in mainstream neoclassical economics, who very rarely apply natural science perspectives to their study of markets, but will probably be more congenial to heterodox economists with a background in ecological or Marxian economics. It's appropriate to illustrate the dependence of technology on asymmetric resource flows by considering the emergence of steam power in late 18th century Britain. This is a steam engine, by the way. And here I'll be repeating what Christophe said. I didn't know what he was going to touch on this as well. The material metabolism of steam-driven textile factories in early industrial Britain hinged on the inexpensive labor employed in the American cotton fields and British coal mines, and on the inexpensive land available for the American cotton plantations. The world market prices of raw cotton versus cotton textiles confirm that a British factory owner who sold cotton cloth and bought raw cotton for the same sum of money in 1850 made a net gain in terms of invested labor time and more dramatically in terms of utilized space. Technological progress can thus be reconceptualized as the saving or liberation of human time and natural space in core regions of the world system at the expense of time and space lost in the periphery. I have called this time-space appropriation. A conventional economic analysis would only discern the flows of money, but by considering biophysical metrics such as the embodied labor and land, we can identify asymmetric flows of resources obscured by the apparent reciprocity of market prices. Asymmetric flows of embodied labor time in modern economies have been revealed by economists working in the Marxian tradition, such as Argyri Emmanuel in 1972, whereas the asymmetric flows of embodied land indicate that there is also what I've called an ecologically unequal exchange, and Christophe has given us some illustrations of that. The factor of production referred to as land can be subdivided into raw materials, energy, and eco-productive space. Recent research has shown that the core regions of the modern world system, the United States, the European Union, and Japan, are all net importers of embodied raw materials, embodied energy, and embodied space. Now, I'm going to show you quickly here 4 diagrams showing the net imports. These are the white columns on the right. In absolute figures, that's the left-hand diagram, and per capita, the right-hand diagram, for the year 2007. Now here is net imports of embodied labor. Here's net imports of materials, net imports of energy, and net imports of land. So we have 4 parameters and 3 regions, 3 cores of the world system, and they all show the same pattern. Now, if the growth of industrial infrastructure in 19th century Britain and in modern core regions is geared to objectively measurable asymmetric flows of material resources, we need to ask a number of questions about the implications. Are these asymmetric flows morally reprehensible? Do they imply that technological progress in the United States, Europe, and Japan occurs at the expense of other parts of the world? If so, how has the science of economics managed to obscure such material asymmetries? I would argue that the asymmetric flows of resources in the modern world system are indeed morally reprehensible because they imply that economic growth and technological progress in core regions largely occur at the expense of their trading partners in other parts of the world, and that the levels of affluence in the cores are not possible to achieve universally. The net gains in embodied labor and land that for the past 2 centuries have been prerequisite to core expansion have implied a net loss of such resources for other parts of the world system. The science of economics has obscured such material asymmetries and their moral implications by simultaneously excluding concerns with the material substance of traded commodities and concerns with morality. This view of world trade as having neither material nor moral relevance was established with the marginalist revolution in economics in the last decades of the 19th century. The neoclassical school of economics, which in this period dismissed the earlier concerns of political economy, with embodied labor and land, continues to dominate the discipline and economic policies worldwide to this day. Considering how its preoccupation with market equilibrium systematically obscures the sources and mechanisms of global power and inequalities, it is a paradigmatic illustration of an ideology. If the discipline of economics has simultaneously detached itself from concerns with materiality and morality, this detachment is epitomized by the meaninglessness in the eyes of neoclassical economists of the notion of unequal exchange. Although the concept is sometimes used to denote market power, such as monopoly, the theoretical framework of modern mainstream economics does not conceive of the occurrence of unequal exchange as defined here, that is, as an asymmetric flow of material resources contributing to growing inequalities. Neoclassical economic theory is exclusively concerned with market prices and monetary metrics. Unless actors have exerted power over the market to set prices at other levels than would have been the outcome of free pricing mechanisms, market transactions are by definition fair, or at least morally neutral. The mutual agreement signified by a given exchange rate obviates any additional concerns with reciprocity. This premise of modern economics is at odds with the outlook of political economy up until the marginalist revolution. Different schools of economic thought had previously emphasized different material aspects of commodity trade. Whether the mercantilists focus on precious metals, the physiocrats' preoccupation with embodied land, or the classical economists' concern with embodied labor. But they all based their moral evaluations of trade on the material substance of the commodities exchanged. In abandoning such concerns with the substance of trade in favor of an exclusive focus on market equilibrium, neoclassical economics was left with no other criterion for morally evaluating trade than the extent to which it gave market mechanisms free rein. In this way, the abandonment of material and moral assessments of specific commodity flows were concomitant. The incontrovertibly asymmetric global flows of embodied labor, land, energy, and materials remain outside mainstream economists' field of vision. It is no coincidence that this mode of thinking about trade emerged in Britain at the apex of its colonial power as the ideology accompanying the integration of the modern economic world system. The material asymmetries of the Victorian world order are largely reproduced and intensified today, as illustrated by satellite images of nighttime lights, revealing the contrast between the concentration of luminous technological infrastructure in Europe and North America on the one hand, and the darkness of extractivist zones in Africa and South America on the other. During 1.5 centuries of neoclassical economics, global inequalities have been dramatically aggravated, and yet we are told that its free market agenda is designed precisely to liberate the global masses from poverty. Economics must necessarily deal with morality. There can be no pretense that the rates at which humans exchange their labor and other resources on the market are automatically liberated from moral concerns. In order to grasp how the economist's preoccupation with money has entailed an illusory delegation of moral regulation to the mindless cybernetics of the market, we need to reflect on the very idea of money. The capacity to use money tokens to represent exchange relations and to anchor expanding social structures to such extrasomatic artifacts is uniquely human. For millennia, different kinds of money tokens have been used to concretize and regulate various transmutations of social reciprocity and indebtedness. Like other sign systems, however, the management of money tokens has tended to become a game of its own, with rules continuously rewritten. The human makers of money have become subservient to the logic of their artifacts. This reification of interpersonal relations and the concomitant inversion of power between human subjects and their money objects has been deplored for 2.5 millennia. Aristotle called it chrematistics. St. Paul asserted that the love of money was the root of all evil. Thomas Aquinas proclaimed that greed or avarice was a cardinal sin. Karl Marx aptly coined the concept of money fetishism. They're actually all part of the same genealogy. Meanwhile, however, another strain of thought progressively embraced the reification of human exchange. In the 17th and 18th centuries, philosophers such as Mondeville asserted that commerce was preferable to passions, paving the way for Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Smith's celebration of market exchange, of course, remains foundational for modern economics. This growing appreciation of commerce and accumulation since the early modern period reflects the increasing significance of money in the European merchant states of the time. In contrast to the largely agrarian societies of medieval Europe, the Genoese, Dutch, and British trading empires thrived primarily through the accumulation of money profits, whereas agrarian societies were predominantly focused on harvesting solar energy through crops, livestock, and the labor of humans and draft animals. Mercantile societies shifted focus to the management of money. Although modern concepts of energy did not appear until the mid-19th century, humans have no doubt always been intuitively aware of the vital significance of the sun and what we now know as photosynthesis. The growing preoccupation with money did not represent a liberation from these vital flows of energy, but a new strategy for gaining access to them through purchasing power. The money accumulating in Europe provided access to vast solar-derived resources on other continents, including farmland, forests, livestock, game, fish, and not least, human labor. Money can be viewed as a kind of fictive energy in the sense that it is imagined as a vital flow that nourishes society. It was in the context of such merchant capitalism that textile manufacturers in Britain in the late 18th century adopted steam power. In the struggle to increase reliable outputs of inexpensive cotton cloth for the world market, early British industrialists found fossil energy superior to water power. Engineering was a necessary condition for this development, but it was not a sufficient one. The technological breakthrough represented by James Watt's steam engine would never have occurred. It would neither have occurred nor found to be useful if there had not been great global demand for inexpensive cotton cloth among West African slave traders and American slave owners. Slavery, slave plantations, and the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and America was the foundation for the Industrial Revolution in several ways, by creating demand for its products, by providing cheap labor for harvesting its raw materials, and by offering the plantation as a template for the organization of industrial production. Industrial technology was thus contingent on processes in the 18th century world system. But to reconceptualize industrial machinery and infrastructure as crystallizations of social exchange relations is alien to modern thought. It is difficult for most modern people to equate bounded material objects with the intangible fields of relations which make them possible. Yet this is what the science of ecology has taught us to do regarding biological organisms. The challenge then is to apply the same perspective to technology. A functioning machine is no less dependent on continued resource flows than an organism. As the resource flows provisioning a machine are contingent on market exchange rates, a further conclusion is that the existence of a technological infrastructure is contingent on the relative market prices of labor and other resources. To locally replace the expenditure of labor time with technologies requiring inputs of imported resources embodying labor time expended somewhere else is feasible only when wage differences between the two areas make it economically rational to do so. Globalized technologies, in other words, are products of arbitrage. This is the logic, for instance, behind contemporary exports to Europe and North America of various kinds of electrical equipment manufactured in China. Similar ratios between differently priced resources apply to the utilization of space. After Britain repealed its protectionist corn laws in 1846, the increasing imports of grain to England reflected lower production costs, including land rents and wages, in Prussia and North America compared to those of England. To assert that the relatively low wages and land rents of 19th century Prussia and 21st century China offer these countries a comparative advantage in world trade, as would any follower of David Ricardo, is a rather cynical euphemism for other countries taking advantage of their poverty and relatively lax environmental legislation. Using this terminology of comparative advantage, slavery could be said to have granted the American colonies a comparative advantage in the form of low labor costs. Since the days of Ricardo, the language of free trade has thus promoted the displacement of both work and environmental loads to less affluent sectors of the world system. It continues to justify increasing polarization and deepening inequalities. The mainstream denunciation of protectionism implies a dismissal of any policy to encourage self-sufficiency, reduce vulnerability, and restrain global transports. Given its implicit endorsement of asymmetric resource flows and economic polarization, the concept of globalization ultimately represents a less offensive way of talking about imperialism. In the context of current concerns with climate change, this same neoliberal worldview simultaneously promotes some of the most important sources of greenhouse gas emissions, such as industrial agriculture, deforestation, and global transports of bulk goods. The 19th century British shift to fossil fuels as a source of mechanical energy fundamentally transformed the conditions of economic rationality. It relaxed the ancient imperative to extract energy, for instance, firewood and fodder for draft animals, from the surface of the landscape, and generally reduced the significance attributed to land as a factor of production. Ricardo concluded that the three factors of production, land, labor, and capital, were substitutable, so that, for example, a British shortage of land could be compensated for by an abundance of capital. This observation was based on the experience of the Industrial Revolution, but it didn't raise any concerns regarding the global implications of locally substituting capital for land. As the repeal of the Corn Laws illustrated, the appropriation through trade of the products of other nations' land is tantamount to environmental load displacement. The ecological relief, as Pomerantz calls it, which fossil fuels and imports of grain, timber, cotton, sugar, and other colonial produce granted to Britain, represented a geographical space several times the total land area of Great Britain. And here again, Christoph has shown us this. Industrialization can thus be seen as a strategy for appropriating eco-productive space elsewhere in the world system, and modern calculations of ecological footprints confirm that the same strategy has continued to be fundamental to economic growth and technological progress in core countries for over 200 years. An implication of this understanding of technology as contingent on ecologically unequal exchange is that we have reasons to be skeptical toward proposals for solving problems of sustainability that are founded on expectations of technological progress. Technological utopianism is an integral part of the modern worldview that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. To address the root of sustainability problems, we must instead acknowledge the destructive consequences of modern money. Money is what has made unequal market exchange, impoverishment, and technological overdevelopment possible to begin with. In making everything that humans desire commensurable and interchangeable, money automatically encourages the exchange of industrial commodities for increasing quantities of the natural resources that were used to produce them. The world market, in other words, rewards an accelerating dissipation of resources by providing access to ever more resources to dissipate. The conundrum we need to address is what policy implications can be drawn from Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen's recognition that economic processes simultaneously increase utility and entropy, or in other words, monetary profits and material disorder. But rather than try to make money reflect material reality, which I think is impossible, we should aspire to make it safeguard everybody's material needs. It is theoretically conceivable to design a complementary currency so as to insulate localized flows of necessities and the integrity and resilience of communities as well as ecosystems from the globalized arenas of financial speculation. Whether our priority is to avoid global financial crisis or catastrophic climate change, we shall have to fundamentally redesign the operation of money. Thank you.